Good afternoon, and thank you for joining this advanced CTE webinar, Exploring State Secondary CTE Funding. I am Laura Maldonado, Senior Research Associate at Advanced CTE. I'm also joined by my colleague Marie Falcone, Policy Associate, who is providing technology support for this webinar. So it's great to be in community with you and see folks from across the United States. I appreciate all of you that have put your name and title and place where you work into the chat. It's great to see a good mix of states and titles and people represented. So this session will be recorded and shared on the Advanced CTE website for your future reference. If you have any questions, we encourage you to submit them via the Q&A feature on your screen. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So Advanced CTE developed a shared vision with input from over 200 national, state, and local leaders for the future of career technical education. There are 5 principles that identify the systems and structures that need to be challenged and in some cases dismantled. Our topic today is funding, which aligns with Principle 1. Each learner engages in a cohesive, flexible, and responsive career preparation ecosystem. So we want to try to design funding models that direct funding where it is needed most. It is my honor to introduce today's presenters. Joining us today are Drs. Beth Hargis and Clay Long. Dr. Beth Hargis is the Associate Commissioner in the Office of Career Technical Education in the Kentucky Department of Education. She will be sharing information about Kentucky's categorical-based CTE funding model, which uses a student-based approach. Dr. Clay Long is the State Administrator at the Idaho Division of Career Technical Education. Dr. Long will be sharing information about Idaho's categorical funding CTE model, which uses a unit-based approach. We have 60 minutes where I will share information about a website Advanced CTE released in September 2023 on secondary state CTE funding models. I will share the project overview, data collection, and key takeaways. Then we will hear examples from Kentucky and Idaho about their funding models. We will leave time for questions and answers and highlight some additional resources related to CTE funding. So Advanced CTE released the 2023 State of Career Technical Education, an analysis of state secondary CTE funding models in September 2023, which was generously supported by the Walton Family Foundation. The project has been a collaborative effort of many people since spring 2021. I want to especially recognize my advanced CTE colleagues, Kate Kramer, Jody Langelotti, and Stacy Whitehouse for their efforts on this project. I also want to recognize the work of Candace Williams and Kimberly Green, who are no longer at Advanced CTE, but made significant contributions. I also appreciate all the state CTE directors and leaders who completed the survey, participated in interviews about their state funding model, and answered many of my questions via email. So providing high quality CTE requires robust, sustained funding designed to be responsive to both the evolving needs of industry and the diverse needs of learners. It's been about 10 years since RTI International, with the support of Advanced CTE, conducted baseline research on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education. And this project allowed us to gather a baseline view of what's happening in the field now regarding state secondary CTE funding. So states rely on a mix of federal, state, and local policies, often which are shifting and evolving. And the federal government provides funding for secondary CTE primarily through Perkins 5. However, this funding alone cannot usually meet the needs and costs of providing secondary CTE. So many states allocate secondary CTE funding to local education agencies in various ways. Now, local education agencies may also receive gifts from philanthropic and workforce partners, but today's presentation is focused on state funding for secondary CTE. And we recognize, though, that local education agencies are often braiding funding from these federal, state, and local sources. I will quickly review how we collected data for this project over the 2-year timeframe. In early 2022, Advanced CTE conducted a 50-state scan of state funding explicitly directed to support secondary CTE in fiscal year 2022. And this information was sourced from websites of state agencies with governing and administrative oversight of CTE, as well as other language. Another primary source of information and data that served as a foundation for this project was a survey sent to state CTE directors in 50 states and the District of Columbia in the summer of 2022, asking leaders to verify the information that Advanced CTE collected in the scan, confirmed how CTE funding is distributed at the secondary level, and provide the amount of appropriations directed to secondary CTE and specific program areas. So we had 46 state leaders respond to the survey, which was a 90% response rate. We also then conducted interviews with state CTE directors and local administrators in states in fall 2022 and spring 2023 to provide some additional context. So we used all this information to compile this microsite about state CTE funding, which you see in the chat there. Now, I provided the QR codes for the explainer video and the report website. These are helpful to copy and share in other materials with colleagues. The explainer video is great. It's less than 3 minutes, and it can help walk you through the website before you officially start going through things. So that's definitely something to highlight and pull out outside of this webinar. But in the website itself, basically it includes multiple resources. And so depending on your audience, you're probably going to pick and choose what you're going to use with them. There's an executive summary, a research report with recommendations, 3 case studies profiling categorical funding models, an interactive state comparison map, and a downloadable state-by-state table for additional analysis, or that could be used for benchmarking purposes. You can also explore the site to learn about the types of secondary CTE funding approaches and models, get an overview of how secondary CTE is funded in each state, and review recommendations to enhance opportunities for all learners. We'll be sharing some highlights today, but we also do recommend that you try to read through some of these resources and see what might fit best for your audience. So I'm going to focus on 3 main takeaways from the project. So our first takeaway is that approaches to funding state secondary CTE are varied and complex. When I reached out to state leaders about their funding models, complex was often a word that they used. Even states that are maybe using the same funding model often have different and unique approaches within that model. And I have found that some people are very knowledgeable about their state funding model and could point me to finance manuals and business rules and legislation, and other people had more limited knowledge. So what we tried to do with this project is to just explain kind of some of the main models that states are using to fund secondary CTE. And having any type of knowledge about CTE funding can be extremely helpful for you, no matter where you are in your career. So states often allocate secondary CTE funding to local education agencies in various ways, often driven by education funding calculations, historical practices, governance, and state-level priorities. So based on the fiscal year 2022 data that we collected, we tried to group states into 3 main models: foundational, categorical, and hybrid. So we're going to quickly explain kind of some broad definitions for these models model that we place them in for this project. So states invest in secondary education by distributing funding to local education agencies through a foundational formula. And this foundational funding model, otherwise known as basic state funding, often covers the basic costs of education, so salaries, materials, resources. LEAs often receive this funding, and it's often based on attendance or average daily membership and adjusted for learner characteristics, district size, and geographic conditions. Because allocations to LEAs are often independent of learner participation in CTE, local administrators must decide how these funds should be distributed across priorities. So 6 states are basically only using foundational funding and giving LEAs this discretion on how to fund CTE. Now, some of these states do use some non-categorical allocations to support CTE in ways that might not be broadly applied to all LEAs, or they could be having some type of one-time or ongoing competitive grant process or program or incentive funding to support secondary CTE. Now, other states will give additional aid and dedicate that funding for CTE programs that gets distributed to local education agencies. And so that's what's known as categorical funding. And this is the most common model, with 38 states using some type of categorical approach. And these approaches could include cost-based, student-based, and/or unit-based formulas. And they typically target state funding for the exclusive use of CTE programming. I'm going to discuss these approaches at a broad level, but please know again that every state is different in how they employ some of these approaches. So cost-based is when local education agencies are compensated for CTE services based on their actual reported costs from the prior academic year. So states may cap or limit the rate at which eligible expenses are reimbursed, and that could include transportation, equipment, and curriculum services. So 8 states use a cost-based approach, and in our project, we featured North Dakota as a case study. So that case study will kind of go into a little bit more details in how that state employs a cost-based approach. Now, with student-based funding, funds are distributed relative to the number of CTE learners enrolled based on FTE or average daily membership calculation or another type of calculation. And so states are often using state-determined criteria to account for learner enrollment and learner characteristics in CTE programs. So 23 states use a student-based approach. We featured Texas as a case study in the project on our website. And then we have Kentucky here today to share more information about a student-based approach. And then with unit-based, states distribute funds based on a set of educational units and their related costs used to deliver CTE. And so units may include pupils, instructors, equipment, or materials. So 7 states use a unit-based approach, and we featured Massachusetts as a case study in the website. And today we're featuring Idaho for a unit-based approach in today's webinar. Now, when I was reaching out to some states didn't feel they fit in one of the either categorical or foundational models. They said that they maybe use multiple components of categorical funding, or maybe they're using an optional categorical funding approach along with foundational funding. So they asked if there was some type of other category. So we kind of created a hybrid category to reflect these models. And so there's 6 states that determined they think that they fit better in a hybrid funding model versus categorical funding only or foundational funding only. Now, that was the first takeaway with, seeing the complexity and hearing about some of these models. Our second takeaway is that we tried to compare the funding levels provided in this RTI International report 10 years ago with funding that's been provided in fiscal year 2022. And so we found that states have increased their funding of secondary CTE over the last 10 years. Based on what we were able to identify, at least 27 states have increased their state funding, or about 55% of states. This finding is encouraging. However, that also means that about 24 states have not increased their funding over the last 10 years. And think about how much has happened in the world in these last 10 years. And also just think of cost of living increases as well. So that was one of our takeaways. And when I explored that a little bit more in terms of what were those changes for the states that did increase funding? We found that it ranged from $76,300 to $2.8 billion. So quite a wide range there. That is an average of 182 million. Now I did try to I took those 2 outliers out. And when you remove the 76,000 and the 2.8 billion, it comes to about an average of 81 million. So that's one thing in terms of just looking at these changes of increases by states. And then our third takeaway with the project was we are seeing some states make changes to these CTE funding secondary models to try to be more responsive to some needs, including learners. In the last 10 years, it looks at least 15 states have made some type of change in their funding model. Some states, they actually changed from one funding model or approach to another funding model or approach. So for example, for example, New Mexico was a state that they did not have any type of categorical funding. 10 years ago, they were using foundational funding only. And now a CTE fund was created in 2019, and they're using student-based formulas for secondary CTE. And then other states maybe just change criteria within that same funding model. So for example, Ohio shifted from using varying rates for categories of programs to weights, or otherwise known as multipliers. And so this shift within these formulas actually helped increase some funding for certain programs and CTE delivery models. So basically, that was a very quick overview again about some of the takeaways for the project. And it's easy to, kind of talk about these models, in general, but I think it is helpful to hear from states and see, well, what does this really mean within their state? So I have two state CTE directors with us today, and they're going to share information about secondary CTE funding in their state. They're allotted about 8 to 10 minutes for formal remarks, and then we're going to follow up with a moderated question and answer session, and then open up questions from the audience. So we'll go ahead and we will start with Dr. Long in Idaho.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. To quickly paint a picture for Idaho and then kind of talk about some of the changes over the last 10 years. Our agency budget went from 77 million in 2021. This last year was 108 million. We do oversee secondary CTE, including middle school. We oversee the technical college system, fire service training, adult education, and GED. So that total budget is larger than just secondary. But as we go into the next page, and Laura, if you want to switch to the next slide, secondary specifically, I start with our secondary programmatic cost fund, and this is the base funding that every program in Idaho receives. We have cluster programs and we have pathway programs, and there's no delineation in this funding level from a cluster to a pathway. Everyone receives this base amount. We currently sit at $14 million for those funds, and those have gone up about 7 million in the last 4 years. With an increase in influx of support from the governor's office and the legislature. The next several items on there are relatively new when you think of Idaho having CTE for many, many decades. But our program quality initiative, this provides 3 different areas. We focus on the top 2 of incentive and technical assistance. So this allows individuals that, from an incentive perspective, they're meeting all of our benchmark requirements. They have a high quality program, and our technical skill assessments and workplace readiness assessments are measured and mapped to success. And it's automatic. We send it out, and it's $5,000 per program that would receive that. And that total amount is just under $700,000. On our workplace readiness incentive, this again is a newer one. This is the one area of funding that we provide that can go directly to a teacher. This amount came to be in 2019 is when this legislation passed, and it really was an attempt from the legislators and policymakers to recognize the work and effort that our CTE educators are doing. The workplace readiness incentive is just one of the outcomes from this legislation. It also provided a $3,000 allocation per FTE for CTE educators at the district level as a bonus, if you will. And that's just for our occupationally certified teachers. So those that come from a teacher prep program are not eligible. As you can imagine, that is a bit of a controversial topic, but The legislature really wanted to acknowledge the years of experience that folks were bringing to the table to help educate the next generation of the workforce. And that bucket's $200,000. Again, the workplace readiness incentive, that requires folks to pass their TSA, their workplace readiness assessment, and also earn all of the micro-credentials in our skill stack platform to demonstrate competency and mastery of those skills attained. Starting on the right top, our career technical centers. This bucket of fund is just under $5 million. And this is intended for those that have a career technical center, which include both our secondary programs, the base expectations, and then some elevated expectations on top of them. Our career technical centers, because of the increased funds, are not eligible for some of our other incentive funding because they're already receiving those additional funds. But we have 17 of those throughout the state, and that's based again on technical skill assessments, capstone students enrolled, and the credits earned from those participants. The next one, which is our Idaho Quality Program Standards, IQPS, and this is for ag only. This started in 2014 and was really at the work and effort of our agricultural education and teachers. They wanted to identify a grant program to provide additional resources to the ag programs. And this 2014 legislation is actually what pushed for the program quality incentive funding a couple years later. The work that was being done on the ag stuff was great, and we were seeing great progress and increase of data as far as mastery and completion, and wanted to be able to push that out to the other program areas. So that IQPS is just for our ag. That budget amount's about $500,000, and we do $10,000 up to $10,000 grants for each teacher, and this is a teacher-based one. It can't go to teacher pay or teacher salary, but each teacher within a program could be eligible for it. And then we do two $25,000 startup programs. The last category that I put on there is just one-time funds, and Idaho has seen very strong economic times over the last many years. And because of that, we, for the last 4 years, we've always ended up with more in our budget than what we requested. The legislature is very supportive of CTE. The current year we're in, we got an additional $15 million one time. There was also a new fund created called the Career Ready Student Grants. And there was a one-time distribution of $45 million put into that account, and it was for capital projects. So there's multiple things that the council's looking for as they approve those grants. But what we're seeing overall is districts wanting to build a new facility or add to an existing facility to expand their CTE programs. One thing I did skip on the program quality initiative, as I mentioned in the IQPS, we have the startup grant. That is another one of the grants within that PQI area. So it's incentive technical assistance, and then also the startup grants. Overall, one of the things that we really have pushed in the state is making sure all of our programming and decision making for funding is directly tied to labor need. Last year, not in our budget, but relevant to secondary funding for in-demand careers, we've worked through identifying a new scholarship program that's called Launch. And every student in Idaho that graduates high school is eligible for a scholarship or grant up to $8,000 for them to continue on into an in-demand career list. And I bring that up because it's the same list we've been using for modernization and expansion grants to both the secondary and technical college programs to try and start working on building that capacity and ensuring there's access for students when they leave our secondary system. So those are the big dollar side of enhancements. Last legislative session, it was also enacted that every middle school student or 7th or 8th grader is required to complete a career exploration course. And that course is tied to our career standards that we've developed with our middle school programs. So of course, there was no money tied to that, But it is something that we've started into effect this current school year. And I think we truly believe that by having that conversation early on, it doesn't lock a student into something, but at least sets them up for better success of what to pick as they progress through high school. And Laura, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Clay. And we actually had a quick question in the chat. Where might one find the list of in-demand careers?
I can find the link and post it in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Well, we will turn this over to Dr. Beth Hargis from Kentucky now.
Thank you, Laura, and Advanced CTE for the opportunity to explore state secondary CTE funding. CTE funding in Kentucky has been somewhat convoluted over the years and is really a work in progress. We are the perfect example of a complicated system. We had and really still do have different allocations for our state operated centers, which are known as ATCs or area technology centers. And if you don't mind, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. And then we had locally operated centers, which were called LAVEX. And so like all of you, Kentucky is drowning in acronyms, and we're actually using this initiative to help reduce some of those. So we also had CTE taking place in comprehensive high schools, which didn't receive any specified CTE funding. And in fact, the LAVEC designation had some restrictions, including a minimum of 5 program areas to qualify. So as you can imagine, there were great inequities across the state. And just a couple of years ago, a welding student in a state-operated center was worth more financially than a student taking welding in a local center or high school. And so, and again, this is relatively complicated, so I'm going to try to break it down a little bit and tell you the story and get the picture across. But our state-operated centers were receiving roughly $48 million for operations, including salaries and utilities, program supplies, just everything to keep the lights on and actually run the programs. We had a little under $12 million to fund the local centers. And at that time, we funded 42 local centers with 78 roughly qualifying for funding. So obviously we had a wait list and a large number of CTE in the state at the local level that was not funded. And in fact, as school districts figured out what it took to be a LAVEC and the fact that it only dealt with the program area and not the location, that wait list started growing exponentially. So you can see from the second bullet in the 2022 biennial budget, our General Assembly provided a significant increase to CTE funding, resulting in an additional $58 million being available to fund local CTE in the state, bringing the local CTE funding to $70 million. The state centers still receive their funding of around $48 million. And so together, you know, this investment has been a game changer for us. So as you can see, we went from funding originally 42 local centers and 50 state centers to 316 overall locations. And the funding was, and right now is still distributed based on weighted FTEs. So all of our work through this project was launched based on prior CTE studies, recommending a restructuring and funding of governance. And again, I think that goes back to the complexity of it. So you can go to the next slide, please. All right, so obtaining the funding was a huge milestone, but the work wasn't finished. And so we landed on 3 major goals for Kentucky, with the first being to make sure that we could sustain the funding as it was simply a line item budget or a line item in the biennium budget. And fortunately, this has happened. The additional funds are now included in our base funding. So at present, we will be able to continue to fund local CTE at the current rate. However, we still have inequities in the distribution as we're operating from 2 different sources for our state operated centers and our local CTE. And so this has been a priority for us to equalize the value of a student. And this really drove our current funding initiative. We want that welding student to be worth the same amount or or the same amount of funding to the school, regardless of whether they're receiving instruction. We've actually adopted a saying, a welding student is a welding student is a welding student. And so, you can insert whatever program area you want, but we want each student in Kentucky to receive the same quality CTE and resources, regardless of where they receive their instruction. And finally, we want to ensure Kentucky is providing quality CTE and believe a performance-based option in our formula will help bring this to fruition. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what we're proposing in our formula. The state-operated centers, remember, they're getting 48 million, and so they will continue to receive operational funds, the money to keep the lights on, but all of the program-related supplies and equipment will come out of that $70 million addition that we got in 2022. So the $70 million fund will include funding for all program-related expenses for all CTE programs in the state, which are eligible for Perkins funding. We wanted to ensure, and we felt like this was critically important for our General Assembly, that we're not bypassing any federal funds. And so we've tied this to state funding eligibility. Next slide, please. Okay, specifically, that $70 million pot will be distributed through a 60-40 split, with 60% based on weighted FTEs, such as it is now, and 40% based on high quality indicators. And so while we promote the ACTE Quality CTE Program of Study Framework, we selected 4 indicators to include in our incentive or performance funding due to the relevancy in Kentucky and our ability to collect data. So each student will be able to earn all 4 of the indicators throughout their high school career, and we will pull that data for the students for the 12th grade year. So one thing that's not readily evident on this slide is that our proposal includes some innovation and support funds. And again, if this is approved from the General Assembly, this will come from yet another pot of money, which had been in place for unfunded centers for the past few years. And so we're going to transition that over. And so remember, I told you Kentucky funding has been complicated, but these innovation and support funds could be used for new programs and new pathway developments, middle school initiatives, and really support for any unforeseen issues. Over the past couple of years, Kentucky has had several schools that's been damaged from tornadoes and floods, and these funds could be used to support their CTE reestablishment efforts. So we are very excited about that piece of funding particularly, and very anxious to get this entire proposal across the finish line. So next slide, please. So benefits, we think that there are multiple benefits to this funding, and the distribution model, including creating equity in funding, incentivizing quality CTE, recognizing Perkins, and simplifying Kentucky's current model. And I know it may still seem complicated, but I promise you it's a more simplified version than it used to be. So we're cutting down the number of pots of money and ensuring that state and local CTE, regardless of the location, will receive money. Will utilize the incentives and FTEs for funding. And so even if this sounds complex, again, it's much simpler than it was. Okay, next slide, please. So during the implementation process, we're still there. When we started this work, it was very intimidating. All of the leadership within our office, we're all relatively new to our positions. And so this is the first time that we've attempted to promote sizable legislation. And we didn't want this to be a top-down conversation in our office. We wanted everyone to be included. So we included it on our strategic plan. We organized a working committee within our office, and truly that was probably one of the best moves that we made, in that we had wonderful input from everyone. It helped prioritize the initiative. Our policy advisor, with her assistance, we wrote the new bill on how we wanted it, and then we worked to present it to the relevant General Assembly committees. That was very helpful to us, and through all of this, we've received questions that we could go back and research and then better prepare for our next meeting. We were very fortunate to work with two of our General Assembly advocates to sponsor the bill. We presented to local superintendents across the state in groups, at conferences, and at one-on-ones, because we know if they're not happy with it, then it's certainly going to be communicated back to the General Assembly members. We've been running multiple analyses to see where how every venue would stand if it goes through. And now we're absolutely in that waiting period. It's been a very stressful, but it's also been a very positive process. We're hearing good reports, and we are very hopeful that come April 15th, this will all be finalized and will be the new legislative funding process for Kentucky. So thank you. Laura?
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Hargis. And I think we did have one direct question in the chat for you. They ask, what did you call your students who attended your centers, or what the students received had more value because of the instruction at the centers? Can you revisit that part of the conversation?
Certainly. We were just talking about the FTE value. So when you look at all of the money that we have in Kentucky for CTE, and then you're dividing the full-time equivalent students for each of those locations, the students that were in the area technology centers were actually worth more, because those students were divided by that 48 million. But then when you had all of the number of CTE students in the local centers and comprehensive high schools, we only had 11 million. So again, when you divided it out, that one student in the state operated center was worth more from an FTE value standpoint than the ones in the local high schools and local centers. I hope that explains it.
Thank you. Yes, and so now we're going to move into, I'm going to have some questions for Dr. Hargis and Dr. Long. I did see a few questions come through the chat, so I'll quickly just address that. I am going to ask our communications team to upload this recording. We have a YouTube channel, so no matter whether you're a member or not a member, you should have access to that. And I also will send my slide deck to them so that they can have that uploaded also. So you have that as well. So that was another question I saw come through the chat. But what we'll do is I have 3 questions for our presenters, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer. So feel free, if you're thinking about something, in a few minutes here, we'll be able to open it up for any type of question. So our first question is, how does your state's funding structure support the state's vision for high quality CTE? And let's start with Dr. Hargis this time.
All right, thank you. Kentucky has recently adopted United We Learn as our mantra for education. So this vision builds around 3 big ideas, which is creating a more vibrant experience for every student, encouraging innovation in our schools, and collaboration with our communities. CTE is really embedded in all of these points. We feel like we drive it. CTE is also part of Kentucky's education accountability process, and we're pleased that we work hand in hand with academics throughout the state. We go hand in hand. It's not, it takes both to be successful. And so we are very fortunate that the Kentucky State Board of Education, along with our General Assembly, value CTE, and we believe that everything's moving cohesively together.
Thank you. And Dr. Long, could you share about Idaho and their funder structure supporting the state's vision?
Absolutely. I think all of our base funding for all CTE programs allows access to those for all students. When we look at all of our incentive funding and all of our grant programs, I think that's intentionally geared to help recognize those that are producing the results we want. We don't, for those metrics that were quantified to make those funding decisions, we set different benchmarks or levels than necessarily what's in our Perkins plan. But we want to make sure the investments that we're making are delivering additional access to those that want to take part in CTE programs, and then B, making sure that all of the work being done is truly preparing folks for that next step. And whether that be college or entry into a career, all of those grant fundings are aided at that, our base funding is more ensuring they have a quality program, but not paying for performance, if you will, for those specific grants.
Thank you. And then our second question is, what advice would you give to a state leader who might be participating in the process of changing the existing state CTE funding formula or structure? And Dr. Long, maybe we'll have you start with this question.
Sure. I similar to any policy change, I think one of the most important tasks is getting people to the table to start with. Whenever someone hears something's changing, they always assume worse, right? So I think getting all the stakeholders to the table. I know we're in legislative session right now, and if there's things that get brought up in these next couple months that haven't already been vetted and taken to local superintendents and our legislators, it's very difficult to get it across the finish line. Not because it isn't a good idea and not because it isn't a worthwhile cause, but oftentimes that reaction that you get from folks when you say change is coming isn't favorable if they don't very well understand the implications that's going to be tied to it and what that impact's going to be to the district or the LEA.
Thank you. Dr. Hargis, do you want to add anything to that question?
I would say start early. We started about probably a year and a half ago. And of course, we knew it would take a while, but I had no idea that so many things would come up. And, you're still working your full-time job. So it's just very difficult. You need a plan of action. That 30, 60, 90 plan, which really turns into the first year, second year, third year plan. Make a list of what you want to accomplish, how you're going to get there. It's just basic strategic planning. Don't get discouraged, but you got to listen to people. You have to really, get input from all of your different sources and just make sure that you're listening and that you are trying to make the best decision for the students.
Thank you. Yeah, and with this project, we've had definitely some different leaders and CT directors reach out and say they want to try to get involved in some capacity. They know maybe some changes need to be made within some of these funding formulas and structures, but like how do they get to do that? And so that was helpful information for leaders. And then our third question is, what partners need to be engaged when trying to make changes to state CTE funding structures? And Dr. Hargis, if you want to start with this question.
Everybody and anybody. I think Clay touched on that. Local superintendents. I mean, we're the State Department of Education. And so we've got to have their buy-in. General Assembly, this, the State Department of Education for that matter, that's where we work, but we wanted the commissioner to be, on board with this, our State Board of Education. It also helps to have a good policy advisor, a good legislative liaison, and state leadership, people that can, get you in touch with the people that you need to be talking to. And in my opinion, probably most importantly is the workforce. We're meeting their needs and we're trying to make sure that things are going well for the students. So you've got to bring them all together.
Thank you. Anything to add, Clay, for that last question?
No, I think that pretty well covered it.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate your presentations and sharing more about your individual states. Now we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience members. I tried to address some of them as we were going throughout, but Marie, maybe if you can help us if there's anything we missed in the chat or anything that has come in so far. All right, and I'll just highlight that somebody had asked about area technical centers. And so we do have a resource, actually. Advanced CTE put out some information a few years ago on, actually was another microsite on area technical centers. So that could be a resource to check out if you are interested in more information on area technical centers. Even within states, they may have their own type of funding for area technical centers, and that could differ from other types of comprehensive high schools. So just because a state might be, student-based categorical funding, it may or may not be that for the area technical centers in their state. So that was another area where I learned more information as I was talking to different states about this project too. So that's a good question to kind of ask. Within the state, how do you fund area technical centers versus other types of CTE delivery schools? So here's another question. Kind of what triggers the funding for a district or local education agency? Is there some type of program approval process in place? What types of checks and balances are in place? Could you maybe, Dr. Hargis and Dr. Long, could you provide maybe some perspective from that aspect?
Well, the general educational funding is certainly not my area of expertise, but our state General Assembly provides funding to our State Department of Education to send out through what we call SEEK funds to our local districts for education. They receive allotments, and I think it's generally, there are a lot of different finite particulates in there, but for the most part, it's based on their enrollments. And so they receive money. And then it's totally up to the districts if they want to use any of that money to fund any local CTE initiatives that they have. So of course, in Kentucky, we have that local academic funding that they get, but then we have separate CTE funding, which enables us to do, what we've done. It's what I talked about is totally outside of what the local districts receive for the academics.
So for secondary programs, we have a program application process that we require districts to go through. We have them submit documentation and support that align to our program quality framework. If it's a statewide program that's already in existence, we don't require them to submit labor data to quantify why they should be offering it or starting it new. But if it is a new or emerging program that we don't have an existing statewide platform for or a program already identified, then we do have them provide additional labor data and needs for that local region. On an annual basis, we have all districts go back through what we call our local annual application. And that's just reassuring that, the programs we have on file for them, they're going to continue offering. That's an every year process. And we also, in that same LAA cycle, go through what funds can be spent on and have the superintendent sign off on that on an annual basis. So if it's a new program that we don't already have, then with that new request, it triggers a second request for us to look at it at a statewide lens and bring stakeholders to the table to identify if it's something we want to start. Aerospace is one of the ones in Idaho now. And it's a bit challenging because we're not a hub for aerospace. But we have a fairly good sized airport with a lot of pilots specifically living in the area, but because they're not employed through an Idaho employer, they don't pick up on labor data. And so that's an example where we still see there's great value in our economy by having those folks here, but needing to work more closely with that local district or institution to map out that need from an employer perspective.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
And Laura, if I could go back just a moment, because I think I misunderstood the question, but as far as the programs and pathways that receive funding, what we have said is that they will be Perkins eligible. So they will have, they're going through those requirements. But if we have new programs or pathways, we do have a mechanism for people to request that. They fill out an application, it comes to the State Department, and then we are running it through what we refer to as our BEAT teams, which is a business education advisory team. And so they will look at that and provide some input as far as this is relevant to the workforce. And so we do have a process as well to follow.
Thank you. Marie, is there any other questions in the chat or the Q&A? All right, well, we'll do a final question and then I have some resources to share. So when I was doing some of the interviews with more local administrators, they talked about how their just historical knowledge. And so some of these individuals that have gained a lot of funding knowledge are starting to retire or move on. And so maybe what is one piece of advice that you would give to someone learning about secondary CTE funding? We'll do that question, and then we have another last question that came through the chat.
I mean, I'll kick it off, I guess. One of the things that funding for CTE, regardless of what it is, always seems complicated. And I think the intent is to make it as simple as possible. But I think in order to really push priorities or quality, it becomes more and more complicated. And so I think as someone wants to learn about it, understanding a formula or metrics of how that's happening, but also the why behind it. So as they're articulating or sharing it with other people, some people may say, well, that's ridiculous that you would require this, this, and this. And we hear that oftentimes on even just program requests, like, well, why are we giving you so much information? Well, because we don't want to have to shut you down in 2 years because you're not meeting the expectations that we're expecting you to have. So I think really it's trying to learn holistic the approach and maybe not just the specifics of each funding formula, but how does one connect to another?
Thank you.
And I agree with that. I think we have started kind of a repertoire of historical documents, just to, here's how things have worked. And we also have some FAQs that we've generated, because we do have people that will ask, why are you doing it this way or whatever. And so we provide those FAQs to hopefully answer some of those questions. But it is difficult to learn. I think you need to go visit career and technical education. If you've not grown up in that area, you need to go see it. You need to understand. That gives you a better perspective of what it is. But I think it's good that you talk to people, just the people that we previously talked about, your legislators, the people within your own departments, and get that historical knowledge as far as this is where we were and this is where we are. And then so that you can start setting your vision. This is where we want to go.
Thank you. All right, it looks like we did have 2 questions come in. So the first question is, how is data about those remote jobs, pilots, made available to your schools?
So we wouldn't pull data or necessarily provide it. That would be something we would have them do. If a district identifies, for example, that I'll go back to the pilot one, that in their region, that's something that they're seeing a challenge in fulfilling for an airline company that needs them to be based in the local area. We would have them work with the employers on that end and come to the table and not necessarily have a minimum or maximum threshold. So definitely more one-off than other programs where we can look state or regional wide on employer data and say, hey, this meets those benchmarks.
And agreed. We look at the CLNA a lot, and just to verify and validate that is a needed program, and then again start talking, and then they go through that application process. But we also are very fortunate in Kentucky to have KY Stats, and so it contains a lot of information as far as the workforce in general in Kentucky and emerging pathways and job skills. So we are able to use that a lot.
Thank you. And we have another question. It says, any middle school career exploration funding dollars coming in Kentucky?
Hopefully, yes. If in fact, we do have a middle school advisor within our Office of Career and Technical Education who provides resources for our middle school. We are making a big push on that to get it down. It's the exploration piece has got to be moved down, and we all know that, to the middle school level, and even touched on more at the elementary level. So if this goes through, if our new funding formula goes through, there will be some money that we can allocate to for middle school initiatives through an application process. And so, that's what we're hoping to do, is expand it so that, that becomes the norm, that the students are really getting it early. So we are hopeful.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for submitting your questions. We really appreciate those different questions that we received. So to close on out here, I just wanted to provide some additional links and additional resources. So I put the link in to this baseline report that we've referenced that RTI International wrote on behalf for the U.S. Department of Education. I also included 2 resources from Advanced CTE, one on funding models for youth apprenticeships. My colleague Amy Hodge worked on that a few months ago. And then there's another one on braided funding. And then I've tried to put out, so far, 3 blogs are out about this resource, just highlighting some different things. So if you'd like to read blogs, you'll be able to read through those and get some additional links to take you to different parts of the microsite. And so that 3rd blog was actually released this morning about incorporating elements into funding models to address CTE access, completion, and program quality. So those are some things that you can check out to get a little bit more information about CTE funding. But otherwise, we appreciate your time today. Again, this is recorded, and we're going to make sure that we get this information uploaded to both our YouTube channel and our website. But feel free to reach out if you also would like me to send you additional materials also. After leaving this meeting, please complete the quick evaluation that will pop up in your web browser. We want to make sure that this virtual learning series is meeting your needs. And looking ahead, our next webinar that we're doing, this is going to be, our registration is now open. It's going to be on February 21st, 2024, from 3 to 4 p.m. about the 2023 state policies impacting CTE year in review. So we hope that you join us for that webinar. We're going to put a registration link to that in the chat. And then a special announcement, actually our spring meeting early bird registration is now open for our spring meeting on April 29th through May 1st in Arlington, Virginia. So a draft agenda will actually be available on our website on February 5th, 2024. So we've received that question the last few days. So look for that draft agenda on February 5th. But otherwise, thank you so much to everyone for attending. Thank you so much to Drs. Beth Hargis and Clay Long. We appreciate your perspectives from your states. I encourage you to explore the website more and reach out if you have any questions. There's a lot in there. So sometimes if you have something specific, I might be able to find it quicker, or there is some information that we did collect through our research process that actually is not even on the microsite. So I'm happy to help all of you as you're working to look at these models and continue to try to make CTE available for all learners. Thank you, everyone. This now concludes the virtual learning series webinar on exploring state secondary CTE funding.